and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a review for the new Crobuzon or Bas-Lag trilogy by China Miéville. This is what I would call a loose trilogy in the sense that not all of the novels are directly connected to one another. They all take place in the same created secondary universe, but the novels don't feature the same casts of characters and they don't all take place right after one another, though events from like the first novel are referenced in the second and the third and things like that. Those three novels would be Perdido Street Station, that's number 1, The Scar, number 2, and Iron Council, number 3. Genre-wise, it is China Miéville, so it is, broadly speaking, weird fiction. More specifically, I would say weird fantasy, and even more specifically than that, weird urban fantasy with elements of steampunk, horror elements, you could argue, as well. Then The Scar is kind of a pirate, nautical, seafaring, weird fantasy story. And then Iron Council displays elements of Western railroad storytelling, is how I'm going to put it. I can already say that I highly enjoyed these novels. They're not my favorites by Miéville. That title still belongs to Embassy Town and then perhaps Kraken. But overall, it was a really good loose trilogy. Each novel left me with things to think about, strong feelings, and it left its mark on my mind, basically, and I still think about those books, and it's been around a week since I finished them. I'll be keeping this review fairly spoiler-free, but I'll give a brief synopsis of each novel. So with Perdido Street Station, you are introduced to the city-state of New Crobuzon, and so Bas-Lag is the world in which the city-state of New Crobuzon resides. New Crobuzon is the focal point, more or less, of each novel, less so in the second one, but it's still an important element. That's why this is considered the New Crobuzon trilogy, right? So the base premise of the story in Perdido Street Station is that a Garuda comes to the city-state. Garudas being half-bird, half-human anthropomorphic beings, or Xenians as they are named in this world of Bas-Lag. He comes to New Crobuzon to seek the services of a scientist so as to be able to fly again, because his wings were torn off. You learn why later on in the novel, and so he just wants to find a way to fly again by any means necessary. And so the story revolves around this Garuda, but more importantly, this scientist named Isaac and some of his relationships, and then he gets embroiled in a further developing storyline that involves nightmares and people's dreams being eaten by creatures, and I really don't want to say any more than that because that would be spoiling the story, but they're very, very neat concepts in this book linked to that storyline. Then The Scar basically takes place in a pirate city. It follows a main female character who starts out leaving New Crobuzon to go to a colony of that city-state. Her ship gets commanded by pirates and she is brought to a city called Armada. And so Armada is made up of lots of different ships stuck together into a city floating on the open ocean. It's a very cool idea once again, and things happen around this city. I'm not sure it's technically, specifically speaking, a pirate story, but it's a story that features pirates, the sea, ocean faring, and things like that. And then in Iron Council, we kind of get back to New Crobuzon, following characters who are basically trying to get a social revolution going, a socialist revolution going, really, because New Crobuzon is a very oppressive city-state, especially around human beings or Xenians. Like I mentioned, Xenians are basically any kind of humanoid that has animal elements to it. So you've got Vodyanoi, who are half frog, half human beings. You've got the Garuda, like I mentioned. You've got Kepri, which are women with scarab beetles for heads, and things like that. So a lot of humans are very discriminatory against Xenians, and then New Crobuzon basically treats its prisoners, its criminals, in the most horrific way imaginable. It does grafts to these criminals. It attaches machine parts, body parts from other humans, from other animals, and it leaves them scarred and or handicapped or repurposed for a specific job or function. And it's horrific, and those people are shunned by society. So it's a very oppressive city-state. It's not the nicest place to live. And so the characters in Iron Council are trying to mount this revolution to topple the oppressive system, and you've got a cast of characters going into the West, which is why I said the elements of the Western storytelling tradition in there, to seek people who were basically employed by New Crobuzon to build a railway to link up with other city-states on that continent. And they broke free of their employers or, enslavers basically, and created this free city on a very long train. And so the people from New Crobuzon want to recruit those people to bring hope and inspiration to the revolutionaries within New Crobuzon. So yeah, I tried to give a brief picture of each novel. Basically, it all centers more or less around this very strange and oppressive but also powerful city-state of New Crobuzon, residing in this world called Bas-Lag. And there are humans, there are Xenians, so these basically theranthropes, and you have magic, and you have technology, and you have this horrific way of punishing criminals, which, well, entails attaching machine parts, body parts from other animals, and making them deformed and horrific, but also repurposed for very specific tasks and jobs. So before I get further into the world building, a little note on Miéville's writing. So I have done a review for Embassy Town and a review for Kraken by this author. So basically I'm going to reiterate the things I said about his writing in those reviews. It's lush, creative, playful writing. I think China Miéville is a true wordsmith. He uses quite advanced vocabulary, even more archaic words, but then he also makes neologisms that are very inventive and mixes in elements of slang to reflect, for example, the socioeconomic class of his different characters. So a lot of the characters will speak in a fairly rough manner, which you would associate with poorer urban classes from perhaps the 19th century. But then his descriptions will incorporate more fanciful words. Now, some people find that pretentious. Once again, this is going to depend on your personal taste. I personally love this. If there's a word I don't understand, I check the dictionary and I don't mind. Though, funnily enough, a lot of these fanciful words are actually words imported from the French. So knowing French, I automatically know what those words mean. Like he uses puissant instead of powerful, and puissant in French just means powerful. So that was very easy for me. Some people might get annoyed at this, but you got to keep in mind that since it's used consistently throughout his different texts in the different novels, you realize that it becomes actually a part of the world building, because puissant is always used in reference to magic using. So it's actually a word to denote magic. So it becomes a part of like the linguistic world building in a way. So I thought that was actually really clever and not pretentious at all. I'll also note that the chapters tended to be more on the short side, so that's always a plus for me. And I personally thought it read fairly quickly, even though, like I said, it's perhaps a more fanciful level of English. It's a good level of English. It's well written, and as such, since it was well written, it read very smoothly. And beyond the short chapters are always like different parts, lots of different parts with the title. It's a kind of structure I really enjoy as a general rule. The pacing was very good overall. I didn't have any particular complaints on that front. And also, each novel, except perhaps The Scar, so the second one, features multiple points of view. So you have a small cast of reasonably diverse characters and you will get their points of view, except, like I said a bit, in The Scar. I mean, you do get multiple points of view, but you principally get the point of view of the main female character. Character work-wise, I don't think this is necessarily the best I've seen from Mr. Miéville. However, it wasn't bad either. Like I said, in all but perhaps the second novel, you have an interesting cast of reasonably diverse characters, and you do get a good sense of who they are, a bit of background information on their personal histories, but not that much either. I wouldn't say these are character-focused or character-driven novels, but the character work is not put to the side like it can be in a lot of SFF literature, especially older examples of it. So it's decent character work overall. And I said reasonably diverse. You do get a little bit of LGBT representation, especially in Iron Council. In the first novel, Perdido Street Station, you do get like a cross-species romantic relationship between a human man, so Isaac, one of the main characters of that novel, the scientist, and a Khepri. So like I said, Khepri are these female-bodied humanoids with a scarab beetle for a head. I mean, there are males in that species, but males are basically big beetles, and the females also have a human body and human awareness, or I mean human-like awareness, so you've got cross-species relationship. And in Iron Council, you have a gay male relationship, or I mean, the relationship involves one gay man and a bisexual man. So that was neat. And actually, now that I think about it, Isaac in Perdido Street Station is described, I'm pretty sure, as being dark-skinned. So a bit of diversity in that regard as well. And I'm happy to report that there was no issue whatsoever with female characterization, so thank you once again. And so linked to that, character relationships. You have interesting character relationships and relationship dynamics. I've come to realize that I really appreciate the way China Miéville handles the intimate relationships that bind his characters and the way he handles sexual relationships. I mean, there isn't a lot of sex at all in his novels, at least from what I've seen so far. But when it is there, it's either very respectful, even quite affectionate, or even if it's casual sex, it's still very respectful and overall quite mature between the characters. And it's not cringy at all. So thank you for that. Overall, I would say that personally, I enjoyed the character work in Perdido Street Station and The Scar more than I did in Iron Council, but that also has to do with the types of characters that were more prominent in those stories. I mean, in Perdido Street Station, you have a scientist main character. In The Scar, you have a female main character who's quite interesting. Most of these characters are actually fairly grey as well. They are very human, human-adjacent characters with flaws and qualities. Some are a bit more good than others, some are a bit more bad than others, but I think you can find things to relate to in a lot of these characters, if only in like small amounts, but that's better than nothing. These are books that, go big with the creative world building and the concepts and the theming, which I'll get to in a minute. So world building wise, this was delicious. I mean, so many cool, imaginative concepts were seeded throughout all three of the new Crobuzon novels. Like I said, the focal point of this trilogy is the city-state of New Crobuzon, which is, again, kind of a character in and of itself. It's a city-state character, which is something I also experienced when I read City of Saints and Madmen and Shriek and Afterward by Jeff Vandermeer. It's very interesting to pair that duology and this trilogy and see how both authors approach the idea of a city-state character in weird fiction. It's really neat to pair them together and then compare their differing approaches. They complement one another pretty well, I think. So yeah, New Crobuzon itself has a lot of character. The crap ton of descriptions of the city itself, its insalubriousness, its dark, dank corners, but also its beautiful quarters, its lavishness, its diversity, its, microcultures and urban culture and history and viciousness. I mean, overall, it is a pretty negative portrayal. I mean, it's a pretty repulsive portrayal at times, and yet the characters who come from New Crobuzon love their city-state, with all its flaws, with all its warts and pimples. They love it. It's their home, but it's a very peculiar home. But then there are lots of also just a bit more out there concepts, playing around with, magic and technology, how those two things can interact and intersect. And that's why I also said it's a bit steampunk-ish, because you have a lot of steam-powered machinery. Then there's a subplot in Perdido Street Station featuring AIs via steam-powered robots, basically. So it's steam-powered artificial intelligence. And the magic is also studied at the University of New Crobuzon alongside science. And I mean, it is kind of a branch of science, and it's called thaumaturgy, which I thought was a really cool word. I mean, it's an actual word of the English language, and kind of just went and plugged that word out of a dictionary, I guess. And at some point, there's a character who tries to come up with a unified field theory, combining magic, technology, and psychology. And I live for this shit. That was really stimulating, intellectually speaking, and imaginatively speaking. It really got my juices flowing. Like I said, there's a plethora of races, species. You've got bog standard human beings, and then you've got the Xenians. So you've got frog people, the Vodyanoi, who are amphibious. You've got the Capri, who have beetles for heads and communicate with pheromones and sign language via their mandibles. You've got Garuda, who mostly look like birds, but are anthropoid in shape. They reminded me of the Rito from Zelda Breath of the Wild, funnily enough. And then you've got cactus people, and they're basically, again, humanoids made of vegetable fiber. Their bones are made of wood, and they have spines all over their bodies, and they're green-colored. And then you've got also just weird creatures. In Perdido Street Station, without going into spoiler territory, you have a very strange kind of bug-like thing that can weave through dimensions, and you've got a spider-type thing that can kind of weave through dimensions, and those are very important to the story in Perdido Perdido Street Station. In the scar, you have also this ginormous animal that kind of pops out from a plane of existence into the one of Bas-Lag, and the city of Armada is trying to get to it through magic and technology and electricity and things like that. You've got elementals, you've got golem magic, and just lots of creative things which you can find in standard, or I mean more standard fantasy. It definitely derives from humanity's repertoire of folklore, mythology, and things like that, but then China Miéville kind of puts his own twist on it, and I love that. And then that kind of becomes a springboard for some of his thematic explorations and the exploration of more philosophical, even metaphysical concepts. Like I said, the main character in Perdido Street Station is trying to come up with a unified field theory, unifying magic, psychology, physiological science, basically. But I mean, that kind of reflects the quest of Terran physicists for unified field theory, uniting Newtonian physics and quantum theory. So I mean, it's just really, really neat. And the way China Miéville writes makes this world come to life in a very vivid fashion. I could picture so many things so clearly, whether it were weird beings, weird creatures, action scenes, descriptions of landscapes, or the city of New Crobuzon itself, or even the city of Armada in the scar, so the city made up of ships. It was just so colourful and so lively. Now, one thing I will complain about though, but that's just a me, or more generally a very nerd thing, I would have liked a world map. I'm not always very good at navigating an imagined universe, I guess, in my head, and understanding where people are going exactly according to a compass. So a world map would have been nice. There is a city map of New Crobuzon itself in Perdido Street Station. I would have liked a map of Armada in the Scar, and a map of Bas-Lag in Iron Council, but you know, minor complaint. And now I will move on into the themes. So at the risk of repeating myself, like I said, these books and the books I've read by China Miéville in general so far are just very rich with their world building, their concept crafting, and their thematic explorations. In New Crobuzon, there are like a couple of global themes, which you find in a certain shape or form in each novel, and then each novel also has its own like sub-themes. I'm going to start with themes by novel. So in Perdido Street Station, you definitely have something to do with like artificial intelligence via steam-powered machines and the worry that could pose to the inhabitants of New Crobuzon. The narrative also takes a look at the concepts of identity and belonging, because a lot of the characters are kind of moving in between spheres, societal spheres, or I mean socioeconomic spheres. And the main character, Isaac, like I said, has a cross-species relationship with a Capri woman, and he moves in with an artistic crowd, but he's also a scientist, and he has scientist friends, and then those people kind of become outlaws. So there's a lot of moving around from social sphere to social sphere. And then you also have this Garuda character who initiates the storytelling in Perdido Street Station. That Garuda character has been shunned and outcast from his, well, tribe, I think that's what it was called, because he did something wrong and his wings were torn off because of that. It was an enactment of justice, basically. And so throughout the novel, you get chapters from his perspectives, you get into his head, read his inner thoughts, his perception of things going on around him. And so he thinks back a lot on what he did without you actually knowing what it is he did until the very end of the novel. He's also trying to come to grips with the people around him. Should he help them? But I mean, he's just paying them so he can fly again. But then he wants to do the right thing and perhaps redeem himself somewhat. And so he doesn't really know where he belongs anymore because he's a Garuda without wings. So what does that make him? Where does that leave him? What does it leave him with? You also get this with, so Isaac's lover, the Capri woman who was called Lynn, I think. And she's also a woman who rebelled against a culture. She left her neighborhood and her people somewhat to become an artist, and so she frequents other artists who are human, cacticulae are the cactus people. So yeah, there's a lot of reflection going on about identity, belonging, because you have all these different groups, different socioeconomic classes, but then different species as well. And finally, but that's a much thinner thematic thread, China Miéville plays around with the idea of dreams and reality, or I mean waking life and dream life, and how those things intersect and how one can leach into the other, and playing around with a multi-dimensional universe and and getting outside of the plane of regular reality and seeing things from a higher perspective, basically. I'm going to leave it at that. You'll get it if you read these books, basically, or if you have already read them. But there's some trippy stuff going on there. With The Scar, you shift into something a little different. So the main character is a woman who is leaving New Crobuzon to get to a colony because she got basically in trouble. Well, I mean, she didn't really get into trouble with the law, but she thinks that the law is after her, and so she has to make herself scarce for a bit before eventually possibly coming back to New Crobuzon because that is her home and she really considers it her home. She doesn't really want to leave it, but she kind of has to. But then she gets lifted off by pirates and brought to Armada. But Armada is not an authoritarian city. The pirates are actually democratic, weirdly enough, and they free slaves from New Crobuzon and they offer whatever kind of passenger is on the ships they commandeer, they offer them a new life and a way to integrate into the tapestry of Armada. So they're not all bad, evil pirates, I guess. They're just living in the city and looting other ships, but otherwise, the citizens are welcome to just live out their lives fairly peacefully if they want and become, full participating citizens and things like that. But so the main character of The Scar doesn't want to do that. She wants to go back to New Crobuzon. She doesn't want to integrate. She doesn't want to settle for life in Armada. She wants to find a way to go back. So there's this internal conflict going on throughout the entire novel of missing one's home and missing one's roots, but also at the same time kind of trying to adapt and integrate into this new environment. And who do you then become loyal to? Loyalty is also a thing played around with in The Scar via another character who is one of those remade I mentioned. He was presumably a criminal, though you never really learn what it is he did. It might not have been anything that bad, actually, because you slowly kind of discover throughout these novels that New Crobuzon punishes people for ridiculous shit as well. So it's very unfair and unjust, and obviously poor people get it a lot worse. So this man was remade. He had basically tentacles attached to his chest, but then he gets freed by the pirates of Armada, basically, because they are against this idea of slaves, of remade slaves, and so they offer them a life as free citizens in Armada. But then he's faced with the choice to potentially help New Crobuzon, help protect it for something really bad, and so he has to remember that he did know people in New Crobuzon that were innocent and that were his friends, his family, and so he's torn because he also feels really freaking loyal to his new adopted home. So there's this idea of where does your loyalty lie? Can you be loyal to two different state entities, I guess? And the second big thematic thread and arc in The Scar is, well, as the title might suggest, the idea of scarring, the idea of being hurt and or traumatized, of being scarred, probably for life, but then healing and moving on beyond your scars. There's a lot of interplay with this idea of scarring. You have characters who scar one another, they're lovers, and they scar one another to mark each other as belonging to one another. It's kind of weird and twisted. There's the scarring of the remade. There's the scarring of the world of Bas-Lag, but I'll leave that. Don't want to spoil anything. And even the main female character is scarred by her experience and is scarred by things that happen in the narrative. But then there's a discussion about overcoming your scars, healing, and making something out of the pain you went through. And that really spoke to me. The author laid it on a bit more thickly towards the end of the book. And I don't know, it just really hit me. And then in Iron Council, the most obvious theme is that of doing revolution. Is it better to have a potentially violent revolution or a slow reforming of society, of laws, etc.? But then you also have a thematic thread running around the idea of survival and freedom. Is it worth it to run the risk of being injured, of dying, just to be free? And this is exemplified by this subplot involving a runaway train with freed workers and slaves going into the West and them trying to create this free society on like a moving city train. But they run into significant dangers and a lot of them die, but they want to be free. And then do they go back to New Crobuzon to help their fellow lower classmates to help with their revolution and things like that? Or do they choose to stay free above everything else? Which ties into the other thematic thread of individual versus more collective forms of love. love, which is also particularly exemplified through the relationship between two of the main characters, one of whom is called Judah and the other is called Cutter. They're both men. Cutter is the gay man and Judah is bisexual. And Judah is moved by this insane sense of altruism and just helping his fellow man/woman. Whereas Cutter really loves Judah and mostly wants to be with him. I mean, he wants to participate in this big revolutionary movement, but most of all, he wants to be with the man he loves. And so there's this clash and conflict between individual love between two people and this more collective love, altruism displayed by Judah to help with the revolutionary project. And then throughout all three novels, you have this big overarching theme of, to put it very simplistically, socialism and class-based oppression, and then class warfare, especially in Iron Council, where it gets expressed through outright revolution. New Crobuzon plays with the idea of a very authoritarian city-state, and a city-state which gets even more authoritarian as time goes on. The New Crobuzon of Iron Council is a lot worse than the New Crobuzon of Perdido Street Station. It is also a police state with a secret police that then comes out into the open and represses people very violently. There's also this creepy ass way of punishing criminals, of grafting them with body parts, machine parts. So this idea of remaking this horrific way of enacting justice by a police state, by an authoritarian state, and what that does to people, how that ferments revolution, but then also looking at the ways class-based oppression intersects or conflicts with, well, in this case, it's not race-based, but species-based oppression, basically, because you have groups of humans who are fairly low class, socio-economically speaking, but they discriminate against the Xenians, so the Vodyanoi, the Capri, the Cactucae, all those half-human, half-something-else hybrids, basically. Well, perfectly decent folk, right? But yeah, they get discriminated against because that's also a basic feature of authoritarian societies and regimes. It's divide and conquer. So you've got the poor people, let's distract them from the fact that we're keeping them poor and disenfranchised by having them hate on another marginalized group. Here, different species, basically, instead of different races, nationalities, religious groups, etc. And there's even a little mention of intersection with sex-based oppression. In Iron Council, it's mentioned how women, even among the oppressed working classes, are shat upon, sorry to be a bit vulgar, by the men. There's a revolt instigated by prostitutes who are sick of having to dish out their services without pay. And the workers on the railroad are angry about this. It's like they want to have sex. But the women are like, you're striking because you're working without pay, yet you expect us to work without pay, what, just because we're women and you supposedly you have manly needs? Like, screw you. And that is based on a lot of, historical fact. This kind of thing has happened in our world, in socialist movements, in communist movements. You've had women take the back seat to the men because their concerns were not considered important enough, were not as important as the class-based concerns and things like that. So I'm happy that China Miéville, acknowledged that within his own narrative. Overall, I think my favorites out of the three were first Perdido Street Station, then The Scar, then Iron Council, so it kind of went down just a smidge as I went through the series. Though honestly, Perdido Street Station and The Scar kind of sit at the same level. I mean, perhaps Perdido Street Station just stands slightly above, because I'm not that drawn to pirate nautical themed stories, though The Scar was very good as well, so I don't know. But Perdido Street Station featured some world-building ideas, some concepts which I really dug hard, so that really played in its favor. And don't get me wrong, Iron Council was still very good. It was just less my thing. I gave Perdido Street Station and The Scar a 7.5 out of 10, and then I gave Iron Council a 7 out of 10. But here's the thing though, as a connected literary entity, I would actually give the New Crobuzon trilogy an 8 out of 10. This is one of those cases where I feel like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I know it sounds weird because none of the individual novels go above a 7.5 out of 10 for me, but somehow the entirety of it just makes an 8. It was just such a creative series. I mean, I already knew that China Miéville was a very creative, imaginative person based on Embassy Town and Kraken. Even The City and the City somewhat, though that is clearly my least favorite of his novels. It is such rich, weird fiction with a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts being explored, being played with, and I love that. So reading this trilogy definitely cements China Miéville as a new favorite author for me. It's a very rare thing for me to have favorite authors, because to me, having a favorite author means enjoying the vast majority of the things I've read by them. So, like, A Song of Ice and Fire is my favorite fantasy series of all time, but I would not say George R.R. Martin is a favorite author of mine. Ursula K. Le Guin is a favorite author of mine, and now so is China Miéville. And if I'm being perfectly honest with myself, then that also kind of goes for Jeff Vandermeer, really. That wraps up my review. If you've also read these novels, please do share your thoughts with me in the comments down below, or if you want to geek out about another of China Miéville's novels, or read fiction in general, whatever. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you all again fairly soon in my monthly reading wrap-up. But until then, I bid you farewell. Bye-bye.